Welcome to our sixth week in our Change of Plans series. In this series, we've been talking through different points in the story of Scripture where things just don't go according to plan, which causes the need for a change of plans. And within these points where everything goes wrong, we're talking about how God has consistently been involved in ensuring that his plan continuously comes to fruition. Up until this point, we've focused on things that have taken place in the Old Testament. But this week we're going to be shifting to the New Testament. And when we come to the New Testament, it helps to realize that roughly 400 years have passed since the writing of the last prophet of the Old Testament, Malachi. And this area of time, this 400 years, is often called the intertestamental period. Malachi wrote in the time after the Babylonian exile, when Jerusalem had already been rebuilt and the temple had been rebuilt. And it's during this 400-year gap when Israel experiences some of the most change that happens to the nation of Israel. And it's these changes that set up the world of the first century where we pick up in the Gospels when we see Jesus come on the scene. During this 400 years, a lot of things politically happen in the ancient world. The Greek Empire grows in strength and then comes in to sweep through and temporarily take over Israel and a whole lot of other countries and civilizations. And then after the Greeks take over, this basically paved the way for the Roman government to come in behind them and utilize and capitalize on the tactics of the Greek armies and the Greek ideas and the language in order to spread the Roman Empire around the world. Rome's main method in doing so was to come into a country and basically they would offer common goods and advantages in exchange for them being allowed to occupy their land and utilize their resources. And it's during this intertestamental period, this 400 years, that the Jewish religion itself experienced tremendous change. Compared to what we read in the Old Testament, the Judaism represented in the New Testament is actually very different. A few different interpretive parties have emerged. The two main ones that we read about in the New Testament are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The rabbis or the religious teachers and scribes have become these kind of traveling teachers that have authoritative teaching to give to people so people can learn from them. And then there's the local synagogue system basically rose up during this 400 years where it kind of decentralized Jewish worship from the temple. Instead of everyone having to always come to the temple, they would instead go to a place in their city called a synagogue, and they would learn the scriptures there and learn about God and worship there. A large body of tradition had emerged from among different interpretations of the law during this time period. And these traditions, they were being elevated to the status of law by the religious leaders of the day. Among the Jews themselves, there was a lot of infighting and disagreement about the law and about tradition and about how you're supposed to apply those things consistently. And because of that, there was a lot of injustice that was happening within the Jewish people based on applying this body of tradition unfairly. If you were a Jew who lived in Israel in the first century, you would live under a constant realization that politically, socially, and religiously, things were not okay. Your land and your economy was owned by a foreign government that only had their best interest in mind, not yours. The social hierarchy within your own people was basically ruled at the top by mostly power-hungry leaders who made frequent, shady kind of backroom deals with the occupying Romans. And if you wanted to make more money yourself as a Jew, you could actually sell yourself to the Romans as a tax collector. And with becoming a tax collector, one of the privileges that you had is in collecting taxes from your fellow Jews. You could kind of fudge the numbers a little bit and actually put a little bit more money in your pocket. And that was legal. This was the environment that existed in Israel in that day. Your religious life in Judaism, it was a fragmented religion where you never really knew if you were violating someone else's tradition or not. So you had to kind of walk around on eggshells, more afraid of the religious leadership than of God himself. But as weird and crazy and fragmented as the world was in the first century, as fragmented as Jewish life was in Israel, there were at least two things that every Jew could agree on, at least in principle. Number one, things are not okay. And number two, we need someone to do something about it. To the Jewish people who read the scriptures, that someone who was going to do something about it was known as Messiah. Now, the word Messiah is simply a Hebrew word that means the anointed one. In the ancient world, especially with the Jews, when a king would be inaugurated as king, they would be anointed with oil in order to signify them as king. They would pour oil on their heads. Kind of a weird tradition to us, probably. But the kings, because of this action that would take place at the beginning, the kings were called the anointed, or in Hebrew, Messiah. So early on in Israel, this title, Messiah, it simply referred to any king that was anointed by the people, that was anointed by God. But as the story of God progresses, this title becomes associated with a figure that's spoken about in prophetic ways, some of which we've already covered in some of our past videos, and you can go back and watch those to get a fuller picture. This future Messiah, this future king, was going to be a kingly figure who would rule on the throne of David forever. He would be someone who would rule with justice and peace and would bring about peace in the land to everyone who lived there. And there's a lot that we could explore about messianic prophecies and how they're fulfilled in Jesus, but that's another subject for another time that we can get into. But the basic idea of this idea of a Messiah, the basic idea for the first century Jew living in Israel was that this Messiah was going to arrive when things were getting really bad. And this Messiah was somehow going to make Israel great again. And so there's this mounting hope that gets greater every year, that in the midst of all of this political, social, and religious turmoil, that everything that God had been preparing Israel up to, that everything he had been preparing them for up to this point would come to be, and that Israel would be restored and that the Messiah would lead them. Here's a sample of the kinds of things that they would have been reading and applying to their current situation. The Messiah isn't specifically mentioned here, but you'll see the future hope of the people shine through pretty well in this passage. I'm going to read Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. It reads, "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills. And all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift sword against nation, and neither shall they learn war anymore." It's a very hopeful passage. And this was the hope for Israel. The expectation was that, at least the expectation in the first century, was that this Messiah that would be coming would be a kingly figure who would inaugurate exactly this in the land of Israel, and that he would restore Israel, and that he would be a powerful ruler who would basically in the first century kick out the occupying government of Rome, and through that he would make Israel great again. This is God's plan.
And so then we move into the New Testament, and specifically today we're going to be in the book of Luke. In chapter 1 there we read about a young woman who is being told that she will give birth to a child. That's not really enough details. We're being told that there is a young woman who is betrothed to a man named Joseph, and also that she is a virgin. And by the way, this message that she is being delivered is coming from an angel sent by the Lord. This woman named Mary is told that she has found favor with God and that she will bear a son, and his name will be Jesus. Now, up to this verse, this is already big news. This is already big news that this young woman is being given. A virgin giving birth to a baby because she has found favor with God. Then we read the next couple of verses and we see that this big news is about to get a whole lot bigger. So we're reading in Luke chapter 1, starting in verse 32. It reads, "He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." As if being told that as a virgin you were going to give birth to a baby wasn't big enough news for you from an angel from the Lord, Gabriel then goes one step further in telling her that this isn't going to be just any baby. This baby is going to be the Son of the Most High. He is going to sit on the throne of David. He is going to reign over the house of Jacob. This baby that Mary was going to give birth to was going to be a king. Mary was bombarded with one surprise after the other, and one can only imagine the amount of flips that her brain was turning at this point, trying to comprehend what she was hearing as well as what she was going to do with all of this information that she had been given. I mean, she wasn't even married up to this point, and now she's being told by an angel that she was going to have a baby, and that baby was going to be the Son of God, and it was going to be a king. That's a lot to process. I mean, a king. Mary wasn't royalty herself. She didn't know what that kind of life looked like. In fact, we read later in chapter 2 of Luke that we find something out. We find something out about the lifestyle of Mary and Joseph. You start in verse 22 there in chapter 2, and you see that they are going to present Jesus at the temple as was required by law. They were also supposed to offer sacrifices according to the law. And we are told in Luke 25 or 2:25 that they offered a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Now, we take this offering and we go back to Leviticus 12:8 where this offering is being explained, and you will see that the offering that Joseph and Mary have made here is an offering that a poorer person would have been making. It was meant for someone who could not afford a lamb with a turtle dove or a pigeon for the offering, and so they were then permitted to bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. So Mary and Joseph were not living any kind of royal lifestyle. They did not know a life of luxury. And so Mary was probably a little taken aback when she was told that her future son would be king. Now, let's go back to the expectation that Jared talked about a little bit earlier. With all the prophecies that had been made in the past, Israel finds themselves in these bad times that were spoken of. But they know that the Messiah is coming. They know that this royal, kingly figure is on his way to save Israel and to give back their land and to bring peace to that land. Now, when you think of a king, where does your brain go? Majestic robes made from the finest materials, a shiny crown and a shiny scepter to go along with it, sitting on a royal throne, emanating power. This great warrior king was going to come and was going to save them and raise up the nation of Israel back to where it belonged. Now, when I go back and I look at this perception that Israel had of the Messiah, I'm always drawn to Isaiah 53. This passage paints a great picture of what the coming king would look like, but it doesn't quite match up with what we've just mentioned. So turn with me to Isaiah 53, and I'll read for you verses 2 and 3. For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of the dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Needless to say, this was not really what was expected. Yet here we see that's what Mary is being told. You, Mary, will give birth to this king. And more so, you think about the usual circumstances under which a future king would be born into, and the life that they would live, especially their early life, right? They are cared for by so many from birth. Their every want and every need is provided for them almost instantaneously. Then you take a look at the conditions in which Jesus was born in. He was born into an impoverished family. Kings are supposed to be born into a kingdom, right? Into a palace and laid in their royal crib, so to speak. Jesus was born and he was wrapped in swaddling cloths and he was laid in a manger because there was no room for him at the inn. This is not what a king was supposed to be born into. Not to mention that when this child was born and he was still a baby, King Herod sends out the wise men to find the child that he might go and worship him. These wise men are warned not to go back and give any type of report to Herod. And when he realizes that they have tricked him, he becomes furious. He then ordered that all of the male children 2 years and under in Bethlehem and the surrounding areas be killed. Luckily, Mary and Joseph had been warned about this future happening and that this was all coming to them, and they were told to flee into Egypt until Herod had passed. So this baby, this child, this king spent the first few years of his life on the run. This is not what a king was supposed to be born into. This is not what the early life of a king was supposed to look like. It's at this point where we might naturally begin to think, wow, change of plans. Because something isn't right. This isn't the way that it's supposed to go.
When it comes to the arrival of this Messiah, this king in Israel, we have to admit that this is really kind of one of those expectation versus reality moments. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of this idea of expectation versus reality. Usually it's somebody who sees a really cool looking cake or some kind of food dish, and they try to recreate it, and the end product, the reality, just kind of looks really funny and terrible. They're funny to watch. But when it comes to Jesus, we kind of get that feeling. There's the expectation, king, majesty, beauty, but then there's the reality. A baby born to a poor family in difficult circumstances. Yes, the reality seems far worse than the expectation, but it's actually exactly the opposite. With the real Messiah, the reality, as ugly as it seems, is far better than this expectation, because the reality of how this coming king made his arrival in the world defines exactly what kind of king, what kind of Messiah he would be. You see, Jesus could have been born into an upper class family. He could have been born to parents that have had significant social influence. But instead, he's born under conditions that match the true temperature of Israel in the first century. The place was a wreck, and that's exactly what he was born into. In Matthew's account of the announcement of the birth of Jesus, the author makes a connection to a prophetic statement from Isaiah about the Messiah. Matthew wrote in Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. See, the author here in Matthew himself, he's quoting from Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, which is where we first see the idea of the virgin birth that Casey talked about. It's where we first see it mentioned. But it's also where we see one of the most important realities concerning what the coming Messiah would be like. They shall call his name Emmanuel. Now, obviously, he was named Jesus as a child, but it's not as though his name was supposed to be Emmanuel and then Joseph and Mary kind of messed it up by naming him something different. In fact, if you look back, the angel tells Joseph that his name would be Jesus, and then Matthew quotes this. You see, they shall call him Emmanuel. It's not saying that this would be the name that Jesus would bear as his given name that we would call him. It's actually a title or maybe more specifically, a description about him. If you read it in Isaiah, you just read the title Emmanuel itself. But Matthew actually translates the name for us in his gospel. He says Emmanuel, which means God with us. And this is the same thing that we see at the beginning of John's gospel account. If you look in chapter 1 of the Gospel of John, the first 5 verses of John chapter 1 talk about this concept of the Word and how in the beginning the Word was with God and the Word was God. And it can seem kind of mysterious. If you read the whole chapter, it makes a lot more sense. But in that same chapter, in John chapter 1, when we drop down to John chapter 1, verse 14, we read this. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. This word, if you read John 1 in its entirety, we find out that it's Jesus. And this is John's really zoomed out way of talking about the birth of Jesus, just as Matthew and Luke both record in their Gospels. John says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. This is often what we call the incarnation of Jesus. Incarnation simply means it's the moment when the pre-existent Word, that this God, became flesh and was born as a human being. And when the Word became flesh, he, being God, had every right to be born into the most lavish of lifestyles. He had every right to live as royalty, to really utilize his status as this Word who is God. He had every right to kind of embody the expectations of the coming king that the Jews expected. But instead of doing that, he does something different. John says he dwelt among us. This is Emmanuel, God with us.
So when God came to do his mission work on earth to redeem his people, he didn't stay in the Ritz-Carlton of Jerusalem or in a palace of any kind. He didn't commute daily into the slums to go and serve the people there. That's the expectation. But instead of that, the reality is he moved in. To us, the way Jesus is born looks and sounds all wrong because he deserves so much more than that. It looks like something with God's plan went totally wrong, that God picked the wrong girl to carry this baby, and now he's got to work extra hard to make it out of the rags and find his way into his riches. But the truth is, this is God's plan. Because God's plan was for his Messiah, for our Messiah to come in humility at his incarnation, and that he would be among those he was meant to redeem. The all-powerful creator, God of the universe, shows up as a defenseless baby born into a poor family in terrible conditions. This baby king will grow up and will in large part live in almost total obscurity until he's around 30 years old. And just as his birth conditions fail to meet the expectations of the popular ideas of the day, what we find out further is that his way of ruling on earth, again, turns the expectations on their head. But the reality is far better, because instead of ruling through force from a throne, he turns the concept of kingdom upside down and rules by serving, and ultimately by getting his own hands dirty to fix the mess that humanity had created from the very beginning. It begins at his ordinary birth, which sets the tone for the rest of the story, that the way God is going to be involved with making his people great again is through literally dwelling amongst his people. And when King Jesus gets involved, we will see the biggest change of plans yet. But this time it's a change in a far better direction. So we'll leave it right there until next time. And next time we will look even further into the ways that Jesus became involved in the mess and how he worked in extremely unexpected ways to reverse the first change of plans that set us all into this. So thank you for joining us this week. And for many of you, we will see you on Sunday. God bless.